Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our next presentation, Trends of the New Threats, which is presented by Timur Biachuev, Vice President of the Threat Research at Kaspersky Lab. Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Timur Biachuev, and today I'll tell you about how we in Kaspersky Laboratory see contemporary threats, and I'll focus on the most significant threats. Today, during this session and in parallel streams, my colleagues have been talking about threats landscape, and I hope I will be able to add something new to it. When we're talking about the most targeted attacks, they are targeted at a limited number of victims and tens of victims. So there's no single security vendor who would have the whole picture about all the threats. And such events like this Congress allow us to exchange knowledge and put together this puzzle of cyber threats landscape. I'll talk about certain trends we see today over the past year, and I will share our predictions or suggestions, hypotheses, how these advanced cyber threats are gonna develop. And eventually we'll talk about how this knowledge can be used for protection scenarios. Talking about studying threats. I work in Kaspersky Lab for 13 years. I'm working for Threat Research Team. It is the largest research department of our company. It is responsible for key competence of our company, protecting PCs from spam, phishing, and targeted threats. There are about 350 people. We're based in 300,000 people. 350 people. Sorry, we're based in Moscow, and we work with technologies in our products and services, and we develop the automated solutions that detects 99.9% out of these 346,000 malicious files detected every day. We have a great company, global research analysis team. It's an international team of experts in 20 countries all over the world, and they investigate most interesting criminal companies, cyber criminal companies. And finding them all over the world allows us to join investigations against these cyber companies. And sometimes these investigations are international. Great and site research allows us to discover a lot of what would you call sophisticated threats. This slide shows you most well-known public investigations that had to do with some big attacks, starting with Stuxnet and Shadowhammer this year. And looking at this slide, you will see that in 2010, the number of the attacks was limited. Today, we're talking about 10 major companies a year. And it shows us what's happening in the world. There are a lot of serious criminal groups all over the world, and they're sponsored by states, some of them, and they can deliver some very interesting cyber campaigns. Today, I decided not to load my presentation with statistics, because we have a lot of telemetrics and that we receive from B2B, B2C, B2G customers from all over the world, and they allow us in real time to look at this picture in dynamics. landscape of cyber threats, but instead I decided to concentrate on a number of cases that will allow me to show you the most interesting and colorful characteristics of these threats. Well, I still have to do some statistics. You see several top industries that are most often affected by APTs. You see mostly B2G sectors, B2B, and industrial and financial sectors, and we'll go through all these sectors. One more number. Over 100 advanced threat actors with tracking, almost more than 100 advanced threat actors today in our Kaspersky lab. We're watching them, but there is a couple of hundreds. And the first challenge that the first trend I would like to mention is that over 15 of those criminal groups are financially motivated. That means that they're not after cyber spying, but rather after financial profits.
What is the challenge here? As was mentioned at the previous session and at other sessions, advanced actors have almost unlimited toolkits. Over the past year, we detected 5 zero-day products in the OS of Microsoft. We detected them by investigating various targeted attacks. Such a zero-day, to detect such a zero-day on your own requires huge qualifications. You can purchase it on a black market for a very large, at a very high price. So that means the actors have qualification, they have the money, and that means a great threat for the entire industry. But let's start with another challenge. I think it's the most important one in the last years. Challenge on supply chains or suppliers. Attacks on supply chains. This is a reference to NIST. Usually those are attacks that are performed by a fraudster that can install malware code, or it can be done by an automated malware program. The criminal infects the software, and via updates it can get access to that system. These days, most types of software are updated automatically, and it's an interesting vector of infiltration into systems of organizations that are very cautious and that have high defenses. This shows supply chains attacks with a timeline, and we see that the number of attacks is increasing. Not all these attacks are confirmed because not all companies are ready to talk about problems with their security. The most interesting example, 2017. 2017 is a major year for cybersecurity industry. The last cyber worm we had was in 2012, and in 2017 we come across it again. We come across the ransomware Petya, the network worm that has Viper functionality. One of the sectors for distributing this malware was an attack on a provider of software in Ukraine, Medoc. It's accounting network. It's accounting systems, accounting software. So the system was infected. And last year there was another interesting supply chain attack that I want to describe. This software for crypto traders appeared. It allowed them to trade on cryptocurrency exchanges, and the software was gaining popularity. It was receiving more and more requests for updates. It had software for Mac OS, for Linux, until one of the organizations in East Asia turned to us for investigating an incident. And after we've investigated it, we discovered that the main problem was that with an update, they received some malware, some malicious code. We tried to contact the developers, but we couldn't get any response from them. According to the information on their website, the developer is deep in the thicket of Central American forests. So we've encountered a very creative approach. Instead of infecting the software of a victim, the fraudster developed their own malicious software, targeted a particular segment, and then delivered the malicious update. Who was behind this attack? If you remember the slides of the previous speaker, the name of the attack was in one of the slides. Lazarus was the actor behind the attack. We managed to identify it. That is evidence of another trend. Lazarus is a group that is sponsored by the state and that focused on gaining financial profit. They have enormous resources for that. This year we already saw a few attacks of Lazarus on financial organizations. A few months passed and we came across another supply chain attack. The first signs of the attack were found on Reddit, a popular resource in America. Some users discovered an update from Asus on their computers with certain mistakes in English words in the name of the program. After a while, we discovered that our behavioral detection was enabled with Asus software. We thought it was a false response, but after a detailed analysis, we found that in fact, in the legal software, some malicious code was installed. Together with desktops and laptops, Asus also supplies software in a single package. And that software was Trojaned. Our telemetry showed that about 50,000 users of our products downloaded this Trojaned software. When the program was launched, it compared the MAC address of the computer against the list. So apparently there had been certain reconnaissance that allowed to collect MAC addresses of victims, and through this supply chain attack, they wanted to implant their malware functionality into the software on these computers. We as vendors have limited visibility. Asus, on the contrary, is very visible and has millions and millions of users that have downloaded this update. But we saw a very limited number of such users. Our colleagues saw similar downloads with their own customers. After several days, we identified another attack from the same actor. 6 companies were the victims this time, mainly in the gaming industry. The number of users that downloaded this implant was almost 100,000. We didn't say it in the news that someone connected the two events with the MAC address and the implant. This is a nightmare for the industry because for those who monitor defense systems at an enterprise, it's a problem because an enterprise has a lot of software assets, And it's very hard to supervise all these activities, especially when it comes to net software, to clean software. For vendors, it can also be a problem. You can get lost in vast arrays of telemetry. And it's also a problem for software developers, because there are thousands of commits every day, if not millions. A compromise can lead to significant reputational risks for the company, reputational damages. Another attack that occurred during the Olympic Games in 2016. At the Games, we saw problems with ticket boxes, ticket desks. The malware network worm was being distributed. It had destructive functions. The result was that computers were knocked out of operation. The actors included in the code of that malware a lot of false flags. That means indicators that are related to other cybercriminal groups. That was done in order to confuse the investigators. The investigators discovered certain lines in a certain language and immediately decided that was North Korea. Who else? But then they discovered segments of code that are typical for other organized cybercriminal groups. We discovered a lot of indicators that were included in the code in order to confuse the investigation. At the end of the day, we did manage to identify the actor, and we saw that it was a subset cybercriminal group, HATES. So in spite of using various tricks like including confusing segments of code in your malware, criminals can use CNCs from other attacks or whatnot, but changing their behavioral pattern is much more difficult, and this is how we manage to catch them, to identify them. After a while, we saw that the same tools were used to perform attacks on financial institutions and educational institutions in several countries across the globe at the same time. We thought this might be an outsourcing of cyber attacks. This is where criminals are taking an order and execute it using their own toolkit. Or maybe criminals could be performing a reconnaissance. Maybe they are preparing the basis for a future attack with their network worms. 2018, another interesting example with pioneers from several companies, the VPN filter attack. IoT, with the rise of IoT and its development, we will have to face more threats and more complicated threats. So far, we've only had DDoS attacks with coffee machines and other devices, but last year, the attack was targeted at routers from about a dozen of providers. The criminals created a botnet from all those robots to infiltrate the traffic that goes through the robots. They could render those routers ineffective at a certain point and block thousands and thousands of computers in subsystems. Attacks on network devices, network equipment, is something new and dangerous, because if it's network equipment, it's hard to equip it with antivirus software. An attack that was identified last year. It started back in 2017, but the investigation of the attack was mostly done in 2018. The attack on industrial systems, Trisis, the Trisis attack. Attack in oil and petrochemical industry in East Asia. The industrial protocols were monitored by the cybercriminals. The companies that fell victims managed to detect mistakes in the logs of the system. And as a result, the attack was not that successful for the criminals. But potentially, such attacks could be very dangerous. The Locker Goga attack, the encryptor attack, mass encryptors are still not as active as in 2017, but we see tailored ransomware. This is where the infrastructure is compromised, encrypted, and the criminals demand ransom for decrypting it. The damage for one of the companies was about $40 billion. And the damage from the losses from downtime, from failures in the system, were even higher. There was a joint event by Europol and several other countries, and instead of stopping their activities and halting their activities, these groups split into smaller groups in their own regions with their own arsenal of tools. So the activity of a large group divided into several groups, which is bad news for us. The UEFI kit, discovered a few years ago, another danger because UEFI defense is still something we're lacking. Conclusion. Some trends that I've tried to illustrate with those examples. In the cyber threat landscape, we see new actors. Old actors are reinforcing their potential. They are creating logic, UEFI. And we see new aggressive actors. Why? Because entering this market is really easy. There are a lot of tools that are readily available, a lot of exploit kits that can be reused in attacks. In one of the famous recent attacks, the criminals simply used the vulnerabilities to their advantage, the vulnerabilities that were there for a long time. We see that in certain areas, the cybersecurity industry is lacking visibility. I'm talking about the VPN filters, for example, or routers where you cannot install a security product, or fire kits with their own vulnerabilities. Several years ago, we already saw how we can use the Intel subsystem to perform conspicuous covert actions. Supply chain attacks can be attractive and effective, and they will definitely be developing. There's one problem with them, with the when there's a targeted attack and criminals infiltrate a certain organization. With the supply chain attack, this malware code can reach all users of the software, and discovering it is just a matter of time.
We see targeted destructive attacks, and we suppose that they'll be used more and more frequently. And spear phishing, unlike the previously described trends, spear phishing, it's there. It will remain to be the main infection vector because it's based on human factor. People are curious. All kinds of leaks that are happening now they're used with no machine learning to make this phishing more more active and more. The Black Hat conference, the participants showed how machine learning can be used in learning in distant systems and to make phishing more targeted and to make victims more susceptible, because it will be using the stylistics, the style these users are used to. But even without that, phishing works really well. What do we do? How do we counter it? Security system that includes prevention systems, detection systems, and fast reaction, and being able to prevent or predict the risks. This is the mantra we should repeat when encountering all these threats. The Guardian agency, they put together all these measures in one framework. But now I would like to emphasize something else. I would like to focus on the defense techniques that I covered today, using threat intelligence reports or APT reports. Fraudsters in the criminal companies can easily use a new arsenal of tools. They can replace hashes, but they cannot change their behavior. They use their scientific research school when they perform those attacks, and aggregating actors' profiles will allow us to define those patterns and to see how they're interconnected, how sub-actors are appearing. How could we use it to defend our organization? First of all, you shouldn't think that a lot of TI is good. You can, allow as much TIs as you want. I mean, you can buy feeds from various security vendors. You can install them into your CM and drown. You can kill your system because you will start. If you have lower quality TI, you'll have a lot of false signals, and you'll have to process them. A lot of TI does not mean you enhance your defense. You need to have quality TI. If you're using in your systems TI that is connected with major actors, by using those, by identifying weak signals, you will identify the moment when an actor enters your organization, and this is the moment when you can install some additional TI that has to do with this actor, and this is when you start. You can start search your perimeter for other signs. You won't be able to download all of them because you'll have a lot of potential false alarms. You can compare those reports with what you have in your infrastructure. You can adapt your defense and monitoring systems, and eventually you have this retrospective option. If you store them in some elastic storage, you can download this TI that has to do with this actor that is supposedly showing interest in your system. You can do some retrospective analysis. Maybe you've had this actor for quite a while already. In general, when you get to know how the most sophisticated campaigns are run in the world, I mean targeted campaigns that are targeted, industry targeted or clients targeted, campaigns based on these reports, you can look at your system and ask yourself, will your defense system be able to withstand a similar attack? Thank you. I'll be happy to take your questions. Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. You focused on supply chain attack, but at the same time, as far as I feel, I think there is a growing vector of firmware intrusion attack. Could we talk a bit about this trend? Are they threatening? Are there many of those? Are they difficult to track, to identify? Are there any ways to counter these attacks? Well, I put the emphasis in the way I thought it would be most interesting. Somehow I cannot go back to my slides. In the trends, I showed that actors are going deeper and deeper into hardware level, router level, network infrastructure, and blunt load jack and firewall kit type. Yes, we do have problems with identifying threats that are so low in the system. We have utilities that allow us to identify the threats, but no vendor is able to remove them from UEFI. We have utilities that allow you to scan it like this. But you're right, probably due to poor visibility, due to lack of opportunities to see such attacks, there are certain cyber campaigns, sorry, that are taking place now. How do we protect ourselves from those? I mean, router attacks. They manifest themselves through behavior. Through victim network, they connect with a command center, and they provide some later on movement. So this is how you can track them, identify them. So this is your universal approach to managing defense. My colleague at the previous center was telling how the headhunting is happening, but we lack protection on these levels. And I would also like to single out one trend, which is very close to what we are talking about. Last year, we were approached. We saw an interesting infection on several websites from public sector. We tried to understand how did they get infected. And we first thought that these websites were on the same driver, which had a vulnerability, and the criminals, they took an obvious path. But it turned out that it was the data processing center, telecom center, was infected, and they were all hosted on this telecom. They're looking for ways, for simpler ways and more efficient ways. Telecoms are one of the vectors that I probably haven't covered in my presentation, but it is by infecting SP providers and telecoms, you can get access to a large number of hosted servers. Any other questions? One more question, because they asked me to deliver it in 30 minutes. Could you share, Dmitry Haber, could you share, out of these 120 teams, how are they distributed geographically? And about Russian-speaking criminals, what are their share? What is their share? Well, in fact, we have a lot of new actors in Asia, emerging in Asia. I won't be able to give you the exact figures for distribution. We have many of them in Russia, and they're pretty advanced. And there's also in, Southeast Asia, yes. Russia, as for Russia, 20 or even more of them are Chinese-speaking. Russia is attacked by 20 different actors at present. Well, attribution is very, it requires a separate story, separate presentation. Thank you very much.